May I say it's a pleasure to be here at Hillsdale College and to participate in this conference on freedom, responsibility, and the American literary tradition. I have elected to focus my thoughts on this topic on Emerson and Hawthorne, who are two major writers of the classic tradition in 19th century American literature, and to speak of them together is to raise to our recollection one of the most lively and creative periods in the history of American literature, and to remember a place, the Boston, Concord, Cambridge, Massachusetts area, where they lived. They had many important friends whose works bear upon their own, who lived around about them. I mean, people like Longfellow and Lowell and Whittier and Holmes and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller and the Peabody sisters, one of whom Hawthorne was married to, Theodore Parker, Bronson and Louisa May Alcott, and even Melville was a close friend of Hawthorne's. Knew him basically in Massachusetts and Vermont, where they vacationed together. This period, the period between the 1830s and 1860s, is often called the American Renaissance because there was such a brilliant flourishing of the literary imagination there during that period, and there seems general critical agreement that few periods, before or since, have produced so many writers and so many works of such great imaginative distinction. One of the reasons why the epithet Renaissance is applied to this period and this place is that Emerson and his followers inaugurated a spiritual movement that permeated New England culture, and as New England then was the cultural capital of the United States, their views tended to permeate to some extent the rest of America as well. There was an upsurging of spiritual intensity in Emerson and his school. It was inchoate in its origins, and at first they didn't know what to call it, so they simply called it the newness. Theodore Parker's sermons, he was a great Unitarian minister of that time and place, and the lectures and essays of Emerson, particularly Emerson's Nature of 1836, The American Scholar of 1837, the Divinity School Address of 1838, and particularly his essay Self-Reliance. These works express the basic faith of this movement, the newness. We now call it transcendentalism rather than the newness, and that's how I'll refer to it. Emersonian transcendentalism was a faith in spiritual intuition as the guide to truth. It was a faith in subjective feeling as the way to validate reality. The transcendentalists subordinated the rational faculty to intuition and subordinated history and tradition to the urgencies of the immediate present. Among the characteristic beliefs of the transcendentalists was a great reverence for nature as the symbol of the divine spirit, the center of the universe. And they urged men to get in touch with the divine oversoul by listening to the inner voice within. One of the disciples of Emerson, a young man named Thomas Wentworth Higginson, later said that the discovery of Emerson would be for any young man a great event in life, but in the comparative conventionalism of the literature of the period, it had the effect of a revelation. Emerson, reflecting back on the period many years later in the essay Historic Notes of Life and Letters in New England, Emerson said that the key to the period appeared to be that mind had become aware of itself. Men grew reflective and intellectual. There was a new consciousness. Now, it's the content of that consciousness, the new consciousness, that I want to consider today, and the reaction it provoked in one of Emerson's most talented contemporaries, Nathaniel Hawthorne. But I want to proceed for a few more minutes to account for what Transcendentalism stood for. William Henry Channing later remarked that the summer of 1839 saw the full dawn of the Transcendental movement in New England, and he defined it as an assertion of the inalienable integrity of man, of the immanence of divinity in instinct, and in part he said it was a reaction against the Puritan orthodoxy. In part it was an effect of renewed study of the ancients, of Oriental pantheists, of Plato and the Alexandrians, of Plutarch's Morals, Seneca, and Epictetus. Partly what happened in this period and at that time was that the German idealism of continental thinkers like Kant and Jacobi and Fichte and Novalis was reinforced by the teachings of Schelling and Hegel and Carlyle and Schleiermacher. And this confluence of thoughts and ideas was in New England engrafted onto what Channing called the stunted stock of Unitarianism. And the result, he said, was a vague yet exalting conception of the godlike nature of the human spirit. For these disciples of the newness, or of Transcendentalism, the movement was a pilgrimage, he said, from the idolatrous world of creeds and rituals to the temple of the living God in the soul. It was, he said, a putting to silence of tradition and formulas that the sacred oracle might be heard through the intuitions of the single-eyed and pure-hearted. Now this movement, Transcendentalism, was essentially a romantic epistemology, and it took as many forms and shapes as its individualistic adherents could devise, but they all shared a common belief in what Channing called perpetual inspiration, the miraculous power of the will, the birthright of the universal good. Now, the old New England sense of sin and damnation, it was endemic in Puritanism, and even reflected in the vestigial Puritanism of New England culture, even evident in Unitarianism at that time. That sense of sin and damnation was abandoned in favor of a belief in the essential goodness of humanity and the possibility by will and action of fulfilling the imperatives of the self. Now, these anti-institutionalists were highly critical of what they call the fossilized institutions of society. They meant particularly the church. They meant the college, Harvard, of course, the political parties, even the government. They were, by and large, a fellowship of like-minded spirits who, on specific issues, tended to disagree pretty frequently, but they were a brotherhood of free and independent thought and of a liberal and hopeful spirit. Of course, for many others in New England, Transcendentalism was a profoundly disturbing movement. Andrews Norton, the Dexter Professor of Sacred Theology at Harvard, was very clear about what he thought Transcendentalism was in his essay called The Latest Form of Infidelity. In any case, some sense of the radical position of Emerson in his circle can be suggested by a consideration of Emerson's essential position on human nature and on good and evil in the universe. For Emerson, the Christian idea of God, and I should emphasize that Emerson started out as a student in the Harvard Divinity School, and he became a minister, a Unitarian minister in Boston, but he resigned his pastorate because he felt that the doctrines and prescribed liturgies of the Christian faith were essentially hollow forms strangulating to the free spiritual development of the soul. So he resigned his ministry to become an essayist and a lecturer and a writer. For Emerson, the idea of the Christian God was defunct, and he described a divinity in terms of a divine oversoul a quasi-pantheistic vital energy, which he said was fundamentally benign, irradiating all of matter. And a man could know the divine presence. How? By studying nature, but principally by consulting his own soul, for the divine oversoul circulated through man as well as throughout all creation. Through the faculty of intuition, a man could know his divine mission in the world. How? Well, not through consulting decalogues or articles of faith or sacred scriptures or church doctrine, but a man could know his divine mission simply by waiting passively for the monitions or movements of the oversoul as it manifested itself within him. Since all creation, according to Emerson, since all creation is divine and moral, all communiques or calls to action from the oversoul have the divine sanction. No inspired act could be immoral, since God or the oversoul or the divine currents of being that circulate within us are moral. Evil as such, Emerson said, evil as such does not exist. He expresses that view in the Divinity School address. Evil is merely the privation of good, that is, the absence of good. And his theory is if we fill up our lives with virtuous acts, evil has no space, as it were, to exist. Now, the notion that there is no active principle of evil, such as we might call Satan or the devil, no agency that has as its central intention the corruption of human virtue, that notion freed Emerson and his followers to think that each one alone could perpetually recreate the world in the image of the divine, that is, in the image of desire. Emerson granted that most men live in a mundane, this-worldly existence, misled by their senses and their merely rational faculties into living on a material plane of existence. And he complains in the essay Nature that man is a god in ruins. Man is the dwarf of himself because he heeds not the voice within him. Well, in reading Emerson, there's something sublimely hortatory in his calling us up to a full measure of our selfhood, indeed of our divinity, and urging us to build, each of us, his own world, as the God within bids us. If we do so, he promises, we will discover that evil will have evaporated into so much nonentity. In the struggle to live the virtuous life, Emerson turns away from the prescriptions of sacred scripture, from prohibitive decalogues with thou shalt nots, from religious commandments of every kind. The ground of ethical behavior for Emerson is to be discovered by consulting the self. Ethics cannot exist for Emerson in following the commandments of an outward authority, however august. And in this rejection of the ethical mandates of institutional religion, we have not only a rejection of the idea of divine revelation on which ethical mandates had been thought to be founded, but we have also a rejection of the past of historical tradition, the past of received theological pronouncements, the past of binding doctrine and dogma. Emerson would say that whether or not the Christian revelation were true, we cannot receive it simply because it comes down to us from the past. We must have an original revelation, each one of us. After all, the prophets and seers, even Christ himself, were men like us who had revelations. Why should not we also have an original relation to the universe, he asks. So, the accumulated wisdom of the race, the amassed and analyzed experience of mankind over generations, over centuries, this counts for naught for Emerson in comparison with the self's intuitive flash of understanding about what at the moment is to be done. Some sort of quasi-mystical impulse validated by feeling about what the individual's course should be. Emerson writes, "What have I to do with the sacredness of traditions if I live wholly from within?" Well, Emerson, of course, was challenged about how he could be sure the impulse within him was good and not evil. And his reply in the essay Self-Reliance may seem astonishing. He says, "My actions do not seem evil to me, but if I am the devil's child, I will live then from the devil. No law," he remarks, and I'm quoting him now, "no law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong what is against it." Now, in sacralizing human nature as divine, Emerson readily dispenses with confession, penance, and absolution. In fact, there's one remarkable line in Self-Reliance that I always stumble over and have to read and reread. He writes, "Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world." No longer need we seek absolution from family or friends or pastor or priest or God. We are to absolve ourselves. And indeed, in Melville's Moby Dick, when Ahab is chasing that whale, and in the act of destroying his whole crew in his insane monomaniacal quest for Moby Dick, Ahab at one point says, "I absolve myself." Well, Ahab is an incarnation, it seems to me, of Emersonian self-reliance run amok. Absolution is a frequent theme in Hawthorne as well, but it would be hard to imagine two neighbors so close who have such a different view of human nature, of history and tradition, and the workings of good and evil in human experience. They knew each other well. Emerson's wife, Sophia, frequently attended Emerson's lectures, and they visited each other's homes. They went for walks together in the woods outside Concourse. Emerson and Hawthorne, I'm sure, read each other's books very tentatively, though like parallel deities, they kept separate from each other, fearing the other's influence. Emerson is very clear that too much influence of another person warps me out of my own orbit. So there was a kind of distance between them, even though they were neighbors and frequent guests. Hawthorne, it seems to me, was frankly disturbed at the discrepancy, as he saw it, between the Emersonian theory of human perfectibility and the reality of human thought and feeling and behavior in actual empirical experience. Hawthorne, as he tells us in the Custom House chapter of the Scarlet Letter, was descended from the Puritans, and he wrote, "Strong traits of their nature have intertwined themselves with mine." Now we have to remember that Hawthorne is living 200 years after the Puritan period in American culture, so there can be no question of his living in the Puritan era. But the traits of Puritanism that had intertwined themselves with his own being were traits having to do with moral realities and psychological realities, as I think he understood the Puritans to have grasped them. One aspect of the Puritan influence over him 2 centuries later was his recognition of the fallen nature of mankind and the tendency in men and women to moral error. In story after story, Hawthorne sought to answer what he thought of as Emerson's unrealistic optimism about human nature. In the short story Young Goodman Brown, his theme is youth's discovery of the ubiquity of evil in the human heart. In this story, a young man leaves his wife one morning and goes into the woods, and as he proceeds deeper into the woods, darkness falls. He has various quasi-supernatural or seemingly supernatural experiences, and eventually he comes upon a devil's Sabbath, a black mass celebrated in the woods, and the devil is there with his disciples, and the young initiates are about to be inducted into the service of evil, and there he thinks he sees his wife. In drawing this scene where at the Black Mass the innocents are going to be initiated into the service of the devil speaks to the new communicants, and I'm quoting from the story. The devil says, "Depending upon one another's hearts, ye had still hoped that virtue were not all a dream. Now you're undeceived. Evil is the nature of mankind. Evil must be your only happiness. Welcome again, my children, to the communion of your race." Well, Hawthorne, of course, did not believe that virtue was a dream. And we should note that it is the devil, the father of lies, and not Hawthorne, who defines evil as the nature of mankind. But Hawthorne is clear enough in this story and elsewhere that a rosy transcendentalist view of the perfectibility of mankind, its claim for man's ability to banish evil impulse, that was a deception. Hawthorne wasn't in any sense, I believe, an Orthodox Christian, but he found in Christianity's view of fallen human nature a more nearly accurate description, if only on the psychological level, of what people really are and what they're fundamentally like. In his short story called Earth's Holocaust, he satirizes both transcendental reformers as well as exotic Christian cults who are awaiting the second coming. These religious reformers have a desire for moral perfection. It is so intense that it is a lust. It is a lust for purification and destruction of that which taints the purity of the soul. In the story, the reformers are led to ignite a bonfire. I suppose they might even call it a bonfire of the vanities. A bonfire upon which they cast all of the worldly monuments of civilization and learning that have lifted men out of barbarism, books and statues and works of art and so on. At the end of the story, the devil appears in the tale. His eyes, Hawthorne writes, glowing with a redder light than that of the bonfire. And the devil mocks these idealistic reformers because they have forgotten to incinerate the human heart. And this is what the devil says. "And unless they hit upon some method of purifying that foul cavern, forth from it will reissue all the shapes of wrong and misery, the same old shapes or worse ones, which they have taken such a vast deal of trouble to consume to ashes." Now, Hawthorne's Puritan ancestors, of course, embraced a belief in the absolute depravity of man, who, in his fallen condition, was a foul cavern of lust, envy, anger, pride, the rest of the 7 deadly sins. And the fate of the natural man for the Puritan, the man unredeemed by God's grace and conversion, was, of course, perdition, damnation. I've stressed that Hawthorne lived 200 years after his Puritan ancestors in a much more charitable and latitudinarian age. And his works, Hawthorne's works, do not clearly manifest a belief in the absoluteness of human depravity. But his works are so full of the sense of sin and guilt, of transgression and error, and of the need for confession and penance, that there can be no doubt that his work is a dramatic protest against the fundamental Emersonian faith in man's benignity and perfectibility. There's a story called Ethan Brand, in which the title character goes throughout the world in search of the unforgivable sin, only to find it in his own heart, which at the end of the story is transformed into stone. Ethan Brand is worth attending to for a moment longer in connection with Emerson. Emerson had announced in Self-Reliance that every individual who would be an individual must go it alone, must live by his own lights, rejecting tradition, history, the accumulated wisdom of the past. Society, in that essay, Self-Reliance, is viewed as inimical to the full actualization of the individual. Whoso would be a man, Emerson says, must be a nonconformist who resists the blandishments of society, its threats, its coercive pressures. If you want to be yourself, you must resist. This is a decisive passage in the essay Self-Reliance. Society, everywhere, is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. Well, there is this sublime aspect of Emerson in that he calls us each to be himself and to be independent and self-reliant. But this view of society, which emphasizes only our craven security at the price of individual liberty, leads Emerson to affirm the necessity, as it may be, of rejecting community, friends, even family. Here's another key passage. I shun father and mother and wife and brother when my genius calls me. I would write on the lintels of the doorpost whim. I hope it's somewhat better than whim at last, but we cannot spend the day in explanation. Do not expect me to show cause why I seek or why I exclude company. And again, he writes, check this lying hospitality and lying affection. Live no longer to the expectation of these deceived and deceiving people with whom we converse. Say to them, O father, O mother, O wife, O brother, O friend, I have lived with you after appearances hitherto. Henceforth, I am the truths. Now Emerson has as his model here Christ himself, who spurns his mother Mary in favor of doing his heavenly Father's will. And most of Emerson's audience would have accepted the necessity of Christ's resistance to his mother. But Emerson believes we're all Christs, who need only consult ourselves, that is, our divinity incarnate, to put in their place relatives, friends, community. This is radical individualism. And I find it very far distant from the sentiment expressed in Hawthorne, the sentiment in favor of our full integration into the fabric of human society. Hawthorne's claim for the value of integratedness into the community is repeated so frequently in the stories and romances that it emerges as an element in the grand design of his fiction, an element in the value system of his art. In the story Ethan Brand, the unforgivable sin turns out to be Ethan Brand's repudiation of our common humanity. He rejects society. He rejects his role in it in favor of a Faustian ambition for godlike individual superiority. This sublime egotism leads him to spurn the human claims of others. Because they are weak and merely human, he becomes a fiendish manipulator of other people. At the end of the story, as Ethan Brand reviews his life just before he suicidally throws himself into the burning lime kiln, Hawthorne writes, and I'm quoting from the story now, that Brand remembered with what tenderness, with what love and sympathy for mankind, and what pity for human guilt and woe, he had first begun to contemplate those ideas which afterward became the inspiration of his life. Those ideas were, namely, what is the unforgivable sin and where is it to be found? He remembered with what reverence he had then looked into the heart of man, viewing it as a temple originally divine and, however desecrated, still to be held sacred by a brother, With what awful fear he had deprecated the success of his pursuit and prayed that the unpardonable sin might never be revealed to him. Then ensued that vast intellectual development which, in its progress, disturbed the counterpoise between his mind and heart. His heart had withered, had contracted, had hardened. It had ceased to partake of the universal throb. He had lost his hold on the magnetic chain of humanity. Now throughout Hawthorne's work, in the stories Ethan Brand and Lady Eleanor's Mantle and My Kinsman Major Molyneux's, and in the Scarlet Letter, whatever the deficiencies of society, for Hawthorne, we cannot exist without it. We fare better when we are in vital relation to it. And the individual who dissents from society and estranges himself from his fellows out of an errant Emersonian egotism, that individual suffers an alienation that inwardly and perhaps even outwardly destroys him. And this I take to be the fate that overcomes many of the principles in the Scarlet Letter, Coverdale in the Blithedale Romance, the pastor in the Minister's Black Veil, and others. The Emersonian claim for liberty as the prior condition of all values, all politics, all religion, all social organization is hortatory and inspiring. But its ultimate consequences, as dramatized by Hawthorne and Melville too, are not, I think, beneficent. In their fiction, disaster follows when the individual sets himself apart from his fellows in some assertion of spiritual superiority or godlike divinity. Now these issues, asserted in Hawthorne's essays and challenged in Hawthorne's stories, bear on the question of how one can know that the exercise of liberty will entail virtuous conduct. What is the ground of one's belief that what he does is beneficent and not immoral? What validates an action as indeed virtuous and not the act of a child of the devil? Emerson is quite clear in Self-Reliance. I'm quoting him now. Trust your emotion. Emotion, feeling, instinct, this validates the conduct out of which it springs. Now, of course, Emerson believes that the voice of the God or the oversoul speaking within man can't deceive or delude him, that the monitions of the divine that flood the soul cannot but be positive. But how many crimes have been committed in the name of a belief that God personally directed an individual to act as he did? Emerson seems harmless as we read him because, frankly, he is drawing on his Christian capital and his training. But if you strip away the Christian substrate to his thinking, you get a different Emerson altogether. You get the Emerson of the Übermensch or the Superman, that Emerson that Nietzsche admired so much. Now, the status of the passions, the feelings, as a source of truth and the ground of ethical conduct, that's what's in question here. The great religions offer theological commentary on this point, and I think I'm not blurring specific doctrinal distinctions when I observe that in religious thought, the feelings and emotions are understood to be inimical to spiritual perfection. The way of the disciple, whether in Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, or Hinduism, the way of the disciple is detachment from the appetites, the feelings, the passions. They commend an asceticism in which the aspiring soul tries to free itself from the seductions of the world and the flesh and the devil. Moreover, in the history of philosophy, Most reflective thought on moral conduct tells us that feeling is an unstable basis on which to decide the great ethical questions of our lives. Short of Epicureanism, with its carpe diem injunction, philosophers from Plato and Aristotle onward have commended conduct based on rational principle rather than feeling, which is transient and easily satisfied and often self-deceived. To these two modes of thinking, the theological and philosophical, we must add the pragmatic, or the common sense conclusions that men have reached after centuries of human experience about how to behave in difficult ethical dilemmas that are always recurring from generation to generation. But trust your emotions. This is just what the saintly Emerson, the former Unitarian minister from Boston, would have us to do. No wonder Emerson was the popular guru of the 60s. Hey, man, do your own thing. That's what he tells us. Now, in the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne explores what happens when a couple, Hester Prynne and Arthur Dimmesdale, act on the imperative of feeling. The novel opens in the early 1640s with Hester Prynne on the scaffold outside the jail being punished for her adultery with the bastard child Pearl in her arms. The community wants to know who the father is, and she refuses to tell. And the father does not identify himself. She is commanded by the community through the agency of the ministers and magistrates to wear a scarlet letter on her breast as the sign of her adultery and immorality. She is seen by the community as subversive of its values, which affirm the rightness of monogamy in marriage and the wrongness of sex with another man's wife. Now, it's customary in these days for us to think the 17th century Puritans harsh in their modes of punition. And when Dimmesdale is too craven to confess his fatherhood of Pearl, we really sympathize with Hester in her solitary punishment. Dimmesdale ought to have confessed his part in the adultery at once, but he doesn't do so. And the consequence for them, as well as for Pearl, and for Roger Chillingworth, who is Hester's husband, the consequences are a train of even greater moral disasters that impel the plot of the novel onward toward Dimmesdale's final sermon, his public confession before all the townspeople, and his penitent death. Now, these disastrous consequences are manifold in the novel. I want to concentrate on one of the characters and one set of consequences. I want to concentrate on Hester Prynne and the meaning of her self-estrangement from the old Boston social order. Because what happens to her is self-estrangement. If she's ostracized by the town, it's mostly because she is impenitent and denies that she has done anything wrong. And I want to comment on the role of her feelings in the definition of her character. First of all, let me note that Hester is one of the most beautiful, passionate, strong, self-reliant, independent heroines in our literature. The sexually fallen, pregnant, utterly abandoned woman is a frequent focus of literary compassion and sympathy. And it's clear that Hawthorne, like Dimmesdale, like many of Hawthorne's readers, is in love with Hester. Her strength as a woman, her resistance to the authority of the ministers and magistrates, her powers of stoic endurance are so striking that to many she seems deserving of our full assent. And this is especially the case in much recent feminist criticism of the novel. But in my view, it's a misreading of the Scarlet Letter to admire Hester Prynne too much. Hawthorne makes it quite plain that Hester's resistance to the ministry of the town elders estranges her from the community. In her Pride and Rebellion, Hawthorne writes, "The links that united her to the rest of humankind had all been broken. During the 7 years of her isolation from intimate involvement with the town life, she was, Hawthorne writes, little accustomed in her long seclusion from society to measure her ideas of right and wrong by any standard external to herself. She's become, in other words, a perfect Emersonian. Hawthorne associates Hester with Anne Hutchinson, the Puritan woman preacher, whose violation of Massachusetts Bay Colony laws in the 17th century led to the charge against her of antinomianism and exile from the colony. Antinomianism is being against the law. Hawthorne tells us that Hester was living in an age when the human intellect was newly emancipated from ancient ideas. And one of these ideas had to do with the role of women in society. Hester's radical free thinking leads her to the position of a modern 19th century feminist. And I think Hawthorne must have had in mind here the views of Margaret Fuller, also his neighbor and Emerson's neighbor, living there in Concord. Margaret Fuller was author of Woman in the 19th Century, a book of nascent American feminist thought, published just 4 or 5 years before the Scarlet Letter. She gave consciousness-raising sessions in Concord, which all the literate ladies of the town attended, including Sophia Hawthorne, the novelist's wife. In any case, Hester's radical free-thinking ideas lead her to the conclusion that and I'm quoting from the novel now, the whole system of society is to be torn down and built up anew. Then the very nature of the opposite sex, that would be men, the nature of the opposite sex with its long hereditary habit, which has become like nature, is to be essentially modified before women can be allowed to assume what seems a fair and suitable position. Hawthorne writes, thus Hester Prynne, whose heart had lost its regular and healthy throb, wandered without a clue in the dark labyrinth of mind. At times a fearful doubt strove to possess her soul, whether it were not better to send Pearl at once to heaven, kill the child, and go herself to such futurity as eternal justice should provide. In other words, commit suicide. And Hawthorne concludes, the Scarlet Letter had not done its office. Now it's because the Scarlet Letter has not done its office that Hester proposes to Dimmesdale that in order to escape the tortures that he is suffering from Chillingworth and the ostracism she experiences, she proposes that they should run away to Europe. And there is a scene of passionate sensuality in the novel in which Hester meets Dimmesdale in the forest 7 years after the adultery. That's probably where it took place. There, Hester expresses her love for Dimmesdale. She takes the Scarlet Letter off her breast. She takes her cap off and lets down her hair in an act of unparalleled erotic suggestiveness in the 19th century. And she proposes their flight from the scene of their guilt. Now, we ought to note in that scene that Pearl, the child, refuses to recognize her mother without that Scarlet Letter on her breast and insists that it be resumed. Why? Well, Pearl is a natural child. That is to say, a child born out of wedlock. And she's somewhat preternatural and elfin, as if she were the allegory of the breaking of some moral law. The forest, in Hawthorne's symbolic scheme, is the scene of the natural act. It is not the scene of civilization, where men and women are bound by civil law, by religious commandment, by socially binding and unifying forms. This forest scene is very poignant, and the couple forgive each other for the wrongs that they have unintentionally inflicted on each other. But more striking is the position that Hester expresses about their adulterous act 7 years before. I'll read you this dialogue between Dimmesdale and Hester. Hester has just told Dimmesdale that the physician, Roger Chillingworth, who has been treating him while he's been getting sicker and sicker and sicker, is really her husband, and that he's been committing tortures on Dimmesdale. Dimmesdale says, "May God forgive us both. We are not, Hester, the worst sinners in the world. There is one worse than even the polluted priest." He's the polluted priest. "That old man's revenge," Chillingworth, "has been blacker than my sin." The sin is adultery. "He has violated in cold blood the sanctity of the human heart. Thou and I, Hester, never did so." "Never, never," whispered she. "What we did had a consecration of its own. We felt it so. We said so to each other. Hast thou forgotten it?" "Hush, Hester," said Arthur Dimmesdale, rising from the ground. "No, I have not forgotten." Now, Hester justifies the original adultery in that it had a consecration of its own. That which is consecrated is set apart as holy. It is blessed. It is informed with religious meaning and value. Yet what she is talking about here is an act of adultery, which throughout the long millennia of men's history has been well nigh universally condemned in societies with any kind of developed ethical consciousness. But what's the ground of her consecration of this adulterous act? We felt it so. She validates her conduct on the basis of feeling. She is the Emersonian transcendentalist I have been describing. Such a person finds a warrant for her behavior in how she feels. Well, we know this message, don't we? We get it 1,000 times a week. If it feels right, do it, says Playboy, or the sitcoms, or any number of public media. If I seem to have trivialized her position, it's because her suggestion that they run away to Europe would be the utter ruination of Dimmesdale, who has already once fallen for the seductive appeal that feeling validates conduct as ethical. And look what's happened to them. Moreover, if he succumbed to this idea this time, we can be sure that this conscience-stricken minister would be utterly destroyed, morally, spiritually, and psychologically. For he is a believer in the divine commandment against adultery. He believes in the rule of Boston civil law condemning it. He believes in the propriety of the community's social stand against it. What she is thus suggesting is the most dangerous moment in the novel, when their immortal souls are hanging in the balance, and his adjuration to her to hush is his gentle way of declining a course of action that would be even more immoral, if anything, than the original adultery. But Hawthorne is not content to let the matter rest there. The ethical and psychological risk implicit in Emersonianism made him abandon the scenic presentation of the action. And he comments in the next chapter, in his own voice, on the meaning of Hester's overture to run away to Europe, where they can cohabit together in a state of sexual lawlessness. Hawthorne remarks, I'm quoting now from the novel, Hester Prynne, with a mind of native courage and activity, and for so long a period not merely estranged, but outlawed from society, had habituated herself to such latitude of speculation as was altogether foreign to the clergyman. She had wandered without rule or guidance in a moral wilderness, as vast, as intricate, as shadowy as the untamed forest, amid the gloom of which they were now holding a colloquy that was to decide their fate. Her intellect and heart had their home, as it were, in desert places, where she roamed as freely as the wild Indian in his woods. For years past, she had looked from this estranged point of view at human institutions and whatever priests or legislators had established, criticizing all with hardly more reverence than the Indian would feel for the clerical band, the judicial robe, the pillory, the gallows, the fireside, or the church. The tendency of her fate and fortunes had been to set her free. The Scarlet Letter was her passport into regions where other women had dared not tread. Shame, despair, solitude. These had been her teachers, stern and wild ones, and they had made her strong, but taught her much amiss. Now, I can't think of another passage in all of Hawthorne's fiction where the narrative voice of the author is so insistent on directing us to a negative judgment of the consequences of radical free thinking, such as we find in Hester and in Emerson and his school. Hester's antisocial view of the human institutions of society is like Emerson's. They are a conspiracy against the manhood, or here womanhood, of all of its members. The institutions which she rejects, the clerical band, that would be organized religion, the church in its institutional character, the judicial robe, that would be the rule of law, the pillory and the gallows, that would be our modes of punishment, and the fireside, that would be the domestic scene or center of familial values. These institutions, which she has rejected, are the very bonds that unite us in our social existence, in the absence of which we would be living in a state of absolute anarchy. But then, that was what Hawthorne's view of the likely consequences of revolutionary Emersonianism would be if Emerson and his fellows got their way. The Scarlet Letter is thus a novel just as much about mid-19th century radical thought in Concord as it is about 17th century Puritanism in Boston. It addresses, only to reject, the radical antinomianism commended by Emerson. It rejects the errant individualism of the Transcendentalists. It calls into question a feminism that would seek to destroy the existing social order with all its faults as well as its virtues in favor of a theoretical or utopian speculation about how things ought to be. And finally, the Scarlet Letter attacks the notion that emotion, rather than principle, should guide us in ethical dilemmas. Hawthorne thus speaks for a conservative vision, a vision of limited human possibility, of a frank recognition of our fallibility, of the need for a social order based on community, of a moral value system founded on actual human experience. Be true, is the motto of that novel. If we err, we confess our error to our fellows. We seek forgiveness. We do whatever penance is necessary, but we must maintain our connection to what he calls the magnetic chain of humanity. After Dimmesdale's death, Hester goes to Europe with Pearl. She drifts about until her daughter's marriage, but then she comes back to the scene of the crime and reassumes the Scarlet Letter, puts it back on her dress. And at this point in the novel, I think we're meant to understand that Dimmesdale's refusal of her offer to run away, his public confession, and his death, and her subsequent experience in Europe have awakened her to the reality that a great wrong really was committed in their adultery, and that her working out of the spiritual consequences of it is to be done in the community where the crime occurred. She becomes something of a ministering angel to the townspeople of Boston in the very end of that novel. In fact, the A comes to stand not so much for adulterous or even able, but angel, Hawthorne says. Well, we have then in the juxtaposition of Emerson and Hawthorne, these two Concord neighbors, some very striking oppositions. The self versus society, feeling versus rational thought, freedom versus responsibility, the passions of the individual versus religious and social values, the role and status of men and women. What can we say about these oppositions and the way that Hawthorne and Emerson dealt with them? Much of the literary expression of the American Renaissance is a manifestation of cultural struggle, where contending values are dramatically debated and tested. The literature of the American Renaissance is an arena where principles are implicitly analyzed and their consequences figuratively represented. Freedom in both Hawthorne and Emerson is assumed as a given, but Emerson and Hawthorne, as I hope I have shown, diverge very sharply on the question of how we make responsible use of that freedom. Thank you very much.